this academic year of the new Direction series of talks, which is run by the Periodicals and Print Culture Research Group here at Nottingham Trent University. And I'm delighted that we've got Sam Bibby here to talk about art journals in the 1970s. Partly I'm delighted because you know, the research of the group goes from the kind of 19th, 20th and up to the 21st centuries. But the period he's looking at in the 1970s is certainly something we've not had anything on, you know, just period wise. So it's just interesting just to hear somebody talk about a different period of periodicals research. So Sam's going to talk for about 40 minutes, then we're going to take questions for 20 minutes or so after. Samuel Bibby is managing editor of Art History, which I'm sure some of you will know is the Journal of the Art Historians Society, or Journal of the Association for Art History. His talk today is going to be taken from his current book project, which is provisionally entitled Art History Works in Print, Producing Periodicals in 1970s Britain. Some of the work has already appeared from this project in journals like Art History and also traditional journals like British Art Studies. And the title, and I'm going to hand over to Sam at this point, the title of his talk is "It Was, Like Any Other Period, a Time of Transition, 1970s Britain and the Native Art Historical Journey." Okay, Sam, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, let's just do that. Let me just check that. Can you all see the screen?
Yes, thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, here goes. Looking straight into the camera, around a third of the way through the first episode of the 1972 television programme Ways of Seeing, John Berger gently declares, "The National Gallery catalogue is for art experts." The shot quickly cuts away to a close-up of the cover to Martin Davis's The Earlier Italian Schools, a volume first published in 1951. Appearing in a section of the programme focusing on Leonardo's Virgin of the Rocks, Berger continued, "The entry on this painting is about 14 pages long, densely written." The camera pans out as simultaneously the catalogue is opened to the relevant pages, subsequently revealed in sequence as a disembodied left hand briskly turns them over. The book is positioned at an angle so as to ensure that its surfaces do not somehow cohere with either the lens of the camera filming it or the screen upon which we see it. Concurrently, Berger's voiceover carries on, his verbal description of the pages drawing attention to the art historical intention of the depicted text's author. They are about who commissioned the painting, legal squabbles, who owned it, its likely date, the pedigree of its owners. Behind this information lie years of research. What for? To prove beyond any shadow of doubt that it is a genuine Leonardo, and to prove that an almost identical painting in the Louvre is in fact a replica. French art historians try to prove the opposite. If one were to come to this passage in the near exact transcription of it, which appeared the following week in The Listener, the BBC's in-house magazine for reproducing broadcasts in print, it would of course read, as indeed intended, as a straightforward exposition of the disciplinary methods of art experts, as a piece of art historiography. And yet on screen, in a move which might almost be thought of, better still be seen, as some form of pictorial footnote, a display of evidence, Berger is at pains to foreground the visual and material reality that he seeks to critique. The description, densely written, doubtless refers to the perhaps impenetrable prose style of the 14-page catalogue entry, penned in nothing short of the forbidding technical language of the expert. But also, it surely alludes to the uninviting reality of its typographic design. Page after unillustrated page of small, tightly leaded, double justified text, each one a monolith of both content and form, and all just enough out of focus to be rendered illegible, inaccessible. That these two words, densely written do not survive in the iteration for the listener, sparing in its inclusion of images might even suggest that the primacy of their meaning was in the visual sense. The entire volume, meanwhile, appears somewhat ominously on screen, almost devoid of context, as though cut out against a black background. If, as Berger suggests, behind this information lie years of research, then we, the viewers, cannot see that. Precisely where it comes from is literally shrouded in darkness and mystery, the shadows of doubt. As Berger makes explicit in the closing seconds of the first episode, it is indebted to the 1936 essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, by Walter Benjamin, which had first appeared in English translation only a few years previously, in 1969. In a move, reminiscent of the earlier visual treatment of the National Gallery catalogue, we're shown a close-up of the programme's title before the shot quickly pans out to reveal the text that adorns the side of a television camera. The implication is that it is one of those used to make just what we have been watching, followed by the appearance of overlaid text acknowledging Benjamin as his source. In Ways of Seeing, Berger, much like Benjamin before him, sought to demystify art and the discourse surrounding it. But crucially, he went out of his way to show how such discourse has been produced and reproduced, not least by him himself. From the inclusion of an excerpt from Żyga Vertov's The Man with a Movie Camera of 1928 that incorporated scenes of his wife editing that very film, to shots immediately afterwards of Berger's own television set emulating a gallery space filled with production equipment, Ways of Seeing reproduces on television the various methods of the reproduction of art, not to mention art history, and in a way which I want to take as something of a cue for what follows. Berger's fleeting focus on the material nature of knowledge reproduction, the National Gallery catalogue as printed object, acts as a prompt for a more sustained consideration of the physical reality of art history in Britain during this same period. Photographic reproduction, such as that on the screen before you right now, taken on a smartphone at a desk in the British Library, help to bring this into focus. What is art history, if not on one level simply an accumulation of printed matter? The importance of such a task, looking at the materiality of art history, lies in the need to demystify the strategies that produce value within the discipline. Berger, for one, certainly realised as much. The means of reproduction he suggested in the book version of Ways of Seeing, published later on that same year, are used politically and commercially to disguise or deny what their existence makes possible. Now, writing in relation to the reproduction of oil paintings in print advertisements, for example, Jacques-Louis David's 1800 portrait of Madame Recamier in an advert for Midol, a menstrual painkiller, his assertion is equally applicable, I maintain, in relation to the reproduction of art history. Railing against a few specialised experts who are the clerks of the nostalgia of a ruling class in decline, Berger gestures here, it seems to me, beyond, say, commercial merchandising to the province of knowledge production and its dissemination. Clerks, after all, make and keep records, analogous with the activities of the art historian. Appropriately enough, and as is often celebrated, Berger's antidote was one in which, in Ways of Seeing, he produced both written discourse, that is, the text of his book, and the multiply reproduced material object that concurrently constituted the work in question. As a note to the reader made clear, the form of this book is as much to do with our purpose as the arguments contained within it. The reproduction of material from the first page on the cover, for instance, or the direct invocation to the reader to turn the page in order to contemplate a version of an already printed photograph of a painting by Van Gogh, now accompanied immediately over leaf by a handwritten caption, point to an understanding on the part of Berger and the team with whom he collaborated on the publication that the value of their message could be accrued in more ways than one. Arguably just common sense, taking Berger at his word, or rather seeing Ways of Seeing, was surely precisely the point. Not only did it present the ideas of the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction to a popular audience, but through its material reality, and above all its design, the book likewise revealed the work of art history in the age of mechanical reproduction, a self-reflexive act which sets the stage not only for what would follow as the 1970s continued, but to what we'll hear in my own contemporary account of it. By this measure, then, we might logically expand our focus one step further to the work of art historiography in the age of mechanical reproduction. Doing so will allow not simply an explanation of the stakes of such an endeavour, the occupation of the clerks of nostalgia, as it is currently largely practiced, but also permit us to loop back around to the subject matter that I ultimately intend to use for my account of journal publishing this afternoon, the representation of printed matter, a deliberately reflexive manoeuvre intended to facilitate an explication of what I'll call the conditions of art historical production. My interest is in seeing what such subject matter might tell us about the objects in which they are replicated, the broader discipline from which such journals hail, as well as the ways in which its histories have subsequently been produced, the periodicals that shaped art history. The birth of this native art historical journal, wrote Michael Hirst in the pages of the Times Literary Supplement in June 1978, is a notable event. A review of the first issue of Art History, the Courtauld-based art historian continued that British art historical periodicals have been too few in number to keep pace with the volume of studies engendered by the art historical boom, so the appearance of a new one is likely to be greeted with relief by the editors of existing periodicals. Art history was not alone, however, for, remarkably, that very same year saw the launch of the Oxford Art Journal, and in the following block, a titanic triumvirate of what was subsequently labelled the New Art History. On a relatively simple level, I want in this paper to account for this notable spate of native, that is, British art historical journals, titles that would provide a vital forum for the rise to prominence of the social history of art. But this won't be a standard historiographical account of the Panofsky Red Regal variety, for instead it's my intention to play the social history of art at its own game, so to speak, or put another way, to consider the conditions of art historical production, not just a rhetorical nod to T.J. Clarke, but rather a move that turns some of the challenges of his famous 1974 call to arms back on themselves. By examining journals such as Art History in terms of the visual and material politics of periodical publishing, I'll argue that the strength of the distinctive mode of the social history of art in 1970s Britain can be accounted for by a collective reaction to the parameters of scholarship and economic mechanisms manifested in the pages of established magazines such as Apollo, the Burlington Magazine, and the Connoisseur, the trinity of ABC, as one contemporary commentator had referred to them. The dissatisfaction with and critique of prevailing structures of publishing implicit in so much of the so-called New Art History directly mirrors, I'll propose, the various challenges to such institutional frameworks made, for example, by conceptual art from the late 1960s onwards, not least through its re-evaluation of the medium of the magazine. Such claims, both for art history and for how its historiography should be carried out, form the basis of the larger project from which the material I will present to you is drawn, one which seeks to provide an account of art history as things seen. For me, the stakes aren't simply historical, by which I mean that it's not my sole intention to reread or re-see what is now heralded as a period of particular importance for the development of this field. Rather, from the vantage point of an age when the ways in which art historical knowledge is produced have since evolved so significantly, it's my intention to prompt reflection on some of the practices of journal publishing today that perhaps either go unobserved or else fail to be held up to the light. And in doing so, I hope to remind us of the importance of continuing to call into question our own institutional disciplinary structures. Hirst's evaluation did not appear in physical isolation, of course. Immediately above it was a review of the first issue of another journal, Biography, an interdisciplinary quarterly, and to the right, an advert for an issue of the periodical Tri-Quarterly, focusing on the history of little magazines in the US. What both of these should serve to remind us is of the need not only to consider periodicals in relation to other titles and their own histories, but also to see editorial content alongside advertising, a strategy of course explicitly pursued by Berger in the 4th episode of Ways of Seeing. Whilst the Burlington and art history might seem at first glance unlikely bedfellows, as I've argued elsewhere, the antipathetic relationship between them is of particular importance. In terms of both content and form, the latter variously sought to distinguish itself from the former. What's more, by a twist of fate, at the precise moment when the latter was first published, the former was marking, with characteristic self-congratulatory smugness, its 75th anniversary. Its editorial for the month of March 1978 took the form of a cloyingly nostalgic portrait of the year of its own birth, 1903. It was, the editor Benedict Nicholson declared, like any other period, a time of transition. Having vaguely situated the magazine within the historical context of the rapidly developing discipline of art history, that year saw the publication, for example, of Lord Balcarres' monograph on Donatello and Bernard Berenson's 2-volume Drawings of the Florentine Painters, Nicholson closed by switching tack, turning from the past to the present. Fortunately, many pleasing symbols of continuity still abound. Many firms among the fine art trade and in publishing, on whom the Burlington magazine have always relied for support, are still vigorous and active. Latent here is a suggestion of two, granted not unconnected, modes of historiographical analysis. On one hand, the textual kind of considering the Burlington alongside monographic and/or attributional cataloguing endeavours. On the other, it's almost as if we're being offered an invitation to approach it in visual and material terms, in relation to what one might call the politics of the page. Indeed, as Jonathan Harris would suggest in his widely respected History of the New Art History from 2001, art history is as much a matter of money and commodities in publishing and the dealing gallery as a matter of ideas and arguments in lectures and seminars. If these economic and commercial bases to art history are not understood, he continued, and the discipline's relationship to these wider social and political processes remains unrecognised or idealised, then claims about the radicalism of developments since the 1970s will be deluding and self-deluding. For us to be able to see this contention at first hand, I want to juxtapose special issues of both the Burlington and art history, each focused, not uncoincidentally, on 19th century British art, and which chronologically bracket the publication in 1974 of T.J. Clarke's The Conditions of Artistic Creation, a manifesto-like invective in which he would resolutely swipe against the dreary professional literature of what Griselda Pollock and Fred Orton would go on to decry as institutionally dominant art history. Taken together, this pair of special issues offers a particularly revealing opportunity to ascertain the marked contrasts in how in Britain art history was being practiced and changed over the course of the 1970s. These case studies show as much in a multi-layered way, for not only do they contain editorial content about the art history of printed and published matter from a British context, but also extend and/or indicate wider networks through the advertisements of books on British art, which themselves reinforce the old and new approaches. But even more interesting is the way in which such adverts in themselves visually and materially foreground the conditions of art historical production, distribution, consumption and exchange, thus offering a threefold chance to subject art history as itself a set of objects to the tenets of its own principles of inquiry, not just then a history of art history, but an art history of art history. Special issue devoted to the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood trumpets the cover with an ensuing litany of great men, as if we needed to be reminded of such a defining parameter. The February 1973 Burlington editorial, lamentingly titled An Overtrodden Path, opened by opining, "Anyone who comes to the pre-Raphaelites from another area of art history and surveys the extent of the literature past and present cannot be blamed for coming to the ungallant conclusion that a relatively minor movement has produced a bibliography out of all proportion to its merits." But this obsession with pre-Raphaelitism perhaps only becomes really mysterious, it went on, when it is judged by the very highest and most unswervingly orthodox standards. When there is ample room for a catalogue raisonné of Botticelli, why bother with men who often provided, at best, but a pale and decorative reflection of his sublime qualities? You have to search very hard indeed for a scrap of new evidence about Botticelli, whereas with the Pre-Raphaelites, you have to be monumentally stupid or lazy not to find something of value. I'm sure that I hardly need emphasize here the obvious importance placed upon the value of evidence, and conversely, the evidence of value. Alistair Greaves' article on Dante Gabriel Rossetti's applied art designs neatly conjures this up in its opening sentences. Rossetti's designs for book bindings offer fewer problems than his designs for frames. They are, for the most part, securely datable and, with 2 exceptions, entirely by his own hand. Their development follows much the same pattern, with the most inventive designs being produced in the decade circa 1860 to 70. The position of such objects within the biographical framework of the artist's oeuvre is patently of paramount importance from the word go. The September 1978 issue of Art History, by contrast, a collection of essays on Victorian art and society, sought to position printed publications within the context of artistic production and audience consumption. Clive Ashwin's account of graphic techniques for reproduction, for instance, argued, then as now, the communication of imagery by means of autographic and allographic prints in the form of book and periodical illustration, advertising and art reproductions vastly outnumbered encounters with original drawings, and as the 19th century progressed, the scale of the demand for pictorial imagery of every kind forced printers and publishers to depend more and more heavily on the services of the professional engraver and craftsman to interpret original drawings into printed media, leading to the absolute predominance of allographic media, such as the reproductive wood engraving. Meanwhile, Robin Cooper's account of the Arundel Society and the popularisation of Renaissance art in Victorian England, in particular through the use of engravings and chromolithographs, revealed the position of importance and influence the Society had attained, ranking with public museums, galleries, exhibitions, art schools, as an agent in the mass dissemination of art, which was such an important aspect of Victorian culture and education in the middle decades of the 19th century. Time, alas, doesn't permit me to linger on how these differing articles present photographically their objects of focus, but suffice it to say, the contrasting textual approaches of each are equally borne out by visual and material means. Recourse to the paratext which frames each of these special issues, however, is just as instructive. Where art history includes a mere 2 pages of internal advertising, the Burlington, in marked distinction, incorporates a whopping 85. From details of a forthcoming Sotheby's sale of valuable printed books, autograph letters and historical documents, the property of, amongst others, His Grace the Duke of Northumberland, Knight of the Garter, to any number of commercial galleries which had evidently rustled up something or other thematically relevant, works by Pre-Raphaelite artists and their associates always on view, the institutions that dominated art history in Britain at this point in time are laid bare for any reader to see as plain as day. As for the conditions of art historical production, the firm of Leighton Sons Service, we are assured, is synonymous with consistent, high-quality process engraving, both black and white and colour. For many years, we have produced the blocks from which the Burlington magazine is printed, firmly relegating any focus on issues of their own reproduction to the realm of mutually reliant commercial patronage. But it is the adverts for books about British art, which are most poignant here. Compare one from the Burlington for a title on Chippendale furniture, a faithful and thorough appraisal of Thomas Chippendale's Rococo work, with one from Art History for Anthea Callan's Angel in the Studio, Women in the Arts and Crafts Movement, 1870 to 1914, which discusses the work, personalities and socio-political background of the pioneer women who spearheaded both a social and a design revolution. Unsurprisingly, each title in itself directly replicates the divergent methodological approaches that we saw earlier. The opening sentences of the editor's foreword to Anthony Coleridge's volume make this abundantly clear. The name of Chippendale is one to conjure with. Indeed, many dealers and collectors have conjured with it to advantage over the past 70 years or so. His was in fact the only name of an English 18th century cabinet maker that has been handed down to us by successive generations. A name that had come to signify quality and elegance and all the refinement of that dazzling age. We need not even get as far as the opening sentence, however, to see Callan's approach writ large. The first chapter title tells us enough. Introduction, Class Structure and the Arts and Crafts Elite, set on a page facing an 1874 group photograph by Frederick Hollier of the Morris and Burne-Jones families, where Coleridge focuses on the short period in the evolution of furniture design in this country when the imported Rococo style in its fully developed form was all the rage. Callan, for instance, addresses the context of design education for women and their work in hand printing, bookbinding and illustration. Technological advances, she explains, had been essential to fill the demands of a period of increasing literacy and the need for cheap books, when ideas of self-improvement and mass education were at a height. But the resultant lowering of artistic standards was not entirely irrevocable, and many of the arts and crafts designers turned their talents to improving the quality of mass-produced books. Again, the conditions of these volumes' production in visual and material terms clearly augments the textual parameters of their art historical modes. The caption to the frontispiece photo of the Chippendale book, tipped in on glossy coated paper stock, for example, states not only that the object represented is owned by one Mrs. R. Mead Fanshawe of Uphook, a stately home in Sussex, but two, that the photograph and indeed lithographic block used to reproduce it of the lacquered and japanned pagoda cabinet were provided courtesy of the magazine The Connoisseur, underscoring networks of possession and economies of discrimination and taste as having been central to what we might perhaps glibly label the old art history. As an advert for Barnes Printing from a 1967 issue of Arts magazine should remind us, the iconography of not just printed matter, but also printing and production processes can bring into clear view the ways in which such material, as well as the labour required to create it, come to be valued. A magazine like this doesn't just happen. The manner in which books and periodicals are themselves variously depicted on their own pages has plenty to tell us when it comes to both the structure of labour needed to produce such material, as well as that which those doing so envisage for the consumption of it. Returning to the adverts for our two case studies, here too can we see the diametrically opposed approaches to the stakes and production of art history and how they variously regarded British art. Chippendale furniture is pictured as though leaning on a bookshelf, belonging to a subscriber to the Collector's Book Club, alongside kindred titles such as The Art of Carl Fabergé and Time and Space, measuring instruments from the 15th to the 19th century. Every year, we are reassured, the world's leading publishers produce a limited number of richly illustrated books of exceptional interest to collectors. High-quality colour printing and good bindings help to make these books remarkable. Beautiful and authoritative, the subheading proclaims. The books are chosen by experts, are the best in each field, and they will provide members at a very much reduced price with a library of collectors' books for reference and pure enjoyment. Production values remain in thrall to the prowess of expertise and material desires of ever grateful consumers. Callan's volume in distinction is reproduced as though emerging from the exact same design as that employed for its own frontispiece. The book, the result of her own labour, as if bringing to the fore, quite literally, not which purchaser or collector might acquire it, but rather emphasising what the conditions of art historical production, here feminist practice, and the practice of female art historians, might create for the prospective reader. The juxtaposition of art history and the Burlington, of what and how they conveyed art historical material to their respective readers, needs naturally to be seen within a larger picture. As T.J. Clarke had put it in the TLS, one thing we badly need is an archaeology of the subject in its heroic period, a critical history uncovering assumptions and allegiances. As long ago as 1980, Rosalda Pollock, for instance, took the Burlington, and in particular its book review section, designated the literature of art, to task. The regulated, institutionally trained professional literature of art history uses its own words to produce a notion of art as ineffable, pristine, discreet. One might expand its use of language to include its visuality and materiality. It thus simultaneously separates art, she continued, from social history and protects its own position as the privileged producer of a literature of art. The social history of art, largely absent from the Burlington and fundamental to art history, emerged from contexts in which formalist approaches and ones which privileged, for example, high modernist painting, were being challenged. Conceptual art, of course, is just one example, but a particularly important one for the medium of the magazine, producing as it did a range of publications which variously sought to disturb and even do away with institutions such as galleries and dealers, critics and collectors. Publications, rather than being secondary information about art, became in many instances primary objects in their own right. Writing in 1970 on the role of documentation in conceptual art, for example, Gregory Batcock proclaimed, "There are no more reproductions. There is no more criticism, no more aesthetics, only art." From at least this point, art magazines had begun to see in their pages interventions by various conceptual artists seeking to reveal the structures that underpinned them. Dan Graham's well-known magazine piece Schema, for instance, exposed evidence of the material nature of the supporting mechanism and the processes used to create it. Liza Baer's Trial Balance, meanwhile, a work for the cover of a 1976 issue of the magazine that she edited, Avalanche, revealed the economic reality of the publication, laid bare beneath the periodical's poignantly in the red masthead. Adverts for and in just such publications bear out these trends exactly like those that we've already seen. An example from the May 1973 issue of British art magazine Studio International for Lucy R. Lippard's renowned anthology 6 Years, The Dematerialisation of the Art Object from 1966 to 72, helpfully lays this out for us. The unusual form of this provocative book intentionally reflects the chaotic network of ideas connected with so-called conceptual art, a statement seemingly visually mirrored to its left in what we might perhaps think of as an homage to Stéphane Mallarmé's Un coup de dé. Just as much of the work that she assembled and chronicled in the book sought to approach language as being the matter of art, think of Robert Smithson, say, or Carl André, so too here has Lippard's own volume been broken up into blocks, almost as if to signal the transition from minimalist sculptural practice to language-based works, a move that characterised much of conceptual art. As Robert Hobbes has argued, conceptual art's critique of modernism was frequently expressed in terms of a desire for art to emulate the intellectual rigour of academic disciplines and took the form of fetishised modes of the scientific display of knowledge. This situation, however, was much more of a two-way street, the academic field of the social history of art, I suggest, looking to the visual and material critiques that constituted conceptual art. My overarching point, then, is that the cases of art history in the Burlington aren't isolated, but part of a significantly larger moment, one that not only sought to destabilise institutionally dominant art, but also art history. As the 70s progressed, the social history of art became a building block for disciplinary change in Britain, visible nowhere more so than on the pages of its art historical periodicals, not just in terms of what they conveyed textually, but crucially, how they also did so both visually and materially. And it's important at this closing juncture to acknowledge my own critical position within the history that I've constructed for you. After all, I'm not a mere disinterested historiographer of journals from the past, but also, of course, a custodian and producer of one today, and one that forms part of my own historical subject. Mine is not, and perhaps never can be, an impartial account. As Howard Singerman put it in his History of Art Education in the United States, I am captured by and folded inside the object of my research. However I attempt to stand at a distance and view objectively, the blindness of ideology and interest, the entanglements of identification and transference, and the traps of textuality lie in wait. Nonetheless, to ward off potential criticism in relation to how responsible it might be to levy potentially negative readings of publications that are, of course, my contemporary competitors, I'd like to make clear my firmly held belief in the collective responsibility that we all have as editorial practitioners, not just to maintain a historical sensibility in relation to our present day work, but also to subject our own backyards to just the kind of scrutiny that it may appear all too easy to wage only elsewhere. Put another way, what might be conceived as all too tempting mudslinging is, as I hope it will be evident, far from gratuitous. Indeed, the journal Art History certainly ought not to be immune in this vein, make no mistake, for it doubtless too warrants just such critical attention on any number of welcome counts. But underpinning my endeavour is the Benjaminian notion that history is like Janus. It has two faces. Whether it looks at the past or at the present, it sees the same things. The objects of art historiographical study are also the means of their own transmission. Even across a temporal gulf, surely such an overlap prompts, if not demands, an act of disciplinary self-reflection. Looking at how journals have been created in the past must, to be sure, inform how they continue to be today, with a further eye to how they will go on to be hereafter. And so I want to close by quickly bringing us forward to today, and to ponder whether the stakes, as borne out in and on the pages of native art historical journals, are any different from what they were some four decades ago. In the December 2019 editorial of the Burlington, championing an apparent renewed appreciation for 1970s art amongst contemporary artists and art historians alike, they suggested one aspect of the interest in the 1970s is aesthetic, a shared liking for the raw and the rough that reflects a belief that art should be a participatory, democratic activity and implies a dislike of the commodification of art that first became obvious in the 1980s. Heralding the thematic focus of the latest issue of their recent online offshoot, Burlington Contemporary, such an incredible lack of self-reflexivity in terms of their own continued position as an agent within this state of affairs is, to me at least, somewhat astonishing. Nowhere is this more apparent than in, yes, you've guessed it, the advertising pages of the very same magazine the following month. Right, the Burlington status as a collectible object is hammered home through the advert for binders in which to amass one's copies of the magazine, rendered almost tangible through the curved tops and bottoms of each adjacent sleeve. To the left, the reader is told, you can help support the Burlington magazine by purchasing books that have been reviewed in the magazine. By clicking through the books link on our website, our partner, John Sandow Books, will generously donate a percentage of your sale to help us in our mission to publish the innovative research and reviews that only the Burlington magazine can. Claims of exclusive supremacy aside, any regard for the utmost independence of editorial content from corrupting commercial issues has clearly been thrown out of the window. Perhaps a last word here might best go to the Burlington, who at the close of their very first editorial in 1903 self-deludingly declared, finally then, we may hope, or at least endeavour, to remove a curious and shameful anomaly, this namely, that Britain, alone of all cultured European countries, is without any periodical which makes the serious and disinterested study of ancient art its chief occupation. Both then and now, past and present, the magazine doth protest too much, methinks. To be clear, however, the case of the Burlington is far from singular. The intersection of histories of the visual representation of printed matter and the contemporary economics of publishing forms a much larger picture, one which continues to be enabled by the means of spectacular technological regimes such as Instagram, equally inseparably entwined with the politics of capital. #Shelfie, #ArtHistory, view shop. Just as fruitfully, we might return here to those pages of John Berger's with which I opened this paper, to consider the value of looking at such material in our own contemporary moment, one in which digital engagement dominates ways of seeing. For Joanna Goss, Berger's 1972 work, unhurried, historically rigorous and critically precise in its style, remains at odds with the clickbaiting, attention deficit economy of contemporary online discourse. Goss's account of Ways of Something, the 2014-15 multi-author video essay put together by the Canadian internet artist Lorna Mills, in which she invited over 100 artists each to produce minute-long moving image sequences responding to the equivalent excerpts from Berger's original, argues for the work and its relationship to ways of seeing to be understood through the lens of the complex and unruly media ecologies of digital culture. The opening contribution to the first episode, for instance, comprises a single shot, produced by artist Daniel Temkin, in which hands can be seen turning the pages of a copy of Berger's Penguin paperback, much like those of the National Gallery catalogue that we saw earlier. Here, numerous passages of the printed text are crudely underlined, belying analogue and manual modes of consumption and research. Every single image in the book, however, has been almost ominously replaced by one of a number of photographic representations of Berger himself. For Goss, Temkin's sequence literally illustrates the displacement of the printed page by the digital, with its seemingly endless capacity for image manipulation, layering, and reproduction. Temkin uses Photoshop, she continues, to produce a meta-commentary on how the digital has eclipsed older technical supports like the printed, illustrated book. In an age where what I want only slightly flippantly to term J-storiography is now the predominant means by which researchers engage with the scholarly record, Ways of Something should prompt continued recourse, I contend, to the contemporary conditions of art historical production, not least all of those, textual, but of course always also visual and material, thanks to which I have brought to bear my own arguments for you all here. John Berger draws his first episode of Ways of Seeing to a close, as I do my paper for you this afternoon, with a direct address to the audience, one in which he both cautions and encourages, and which I shamelessly hijack. Remember that I am controlling and using for my own purposes the means of reproduction needed for this talk. With this presentation, you have received images and meanings which are arranged. I hope you will consider what I have arranged, but be skeptical of it. Thank you.